Hi everybody, this is video 5 and we're going to be talking about resumes and cover letters. Okay, so there's actually two forms of this kind of, catalog of your experiences and skills that you send to employers. The main one, and the one I think that most or all of you is going to use, is a resume. There's another version similar to that called the CV, and I'll talk in a little bit about what a CV is, which is again less commonly used, but those are sort of two terms you might hear as far as, again, that sort of initial kind of list of your accomplishments that you would send out to a potential employer or to anything else that you're applying for. So, for example, if you applied to graduate school, in addition to the statement of purpose, which I talked about in the last video, you will also include a resume, right, or CV. Okay, so let me make some general points about a resume, and then I'll get more into the specifics of exactly what you might think about including on yours. So I think it's important to think of a resume not as like a standard thing, like you have your resume and it's just kind of frozen as that one thing, right? You should be updating and sometimes sort of rearranging your resume depending on what you're doing with it, right? So first of all, of course, your resume changes over time as you do new things or get new experiences, get new skills. But also you should really be tailoring your resume to the specific position that you're applying for, right? Some positions you want to highlight one thing or the other, and you should do that, right? You really want to put your best foot forward. So don't keep one version of your resume and send it to everything. Think about the purpose of the resume in that particular context. So the resume, the goal for the resume is to showcase your knowledge, your skills, your abilities, your credentials, right? You need to do that in a very succinct way. So it's important to think about which of those things you want to really emphasize and how you should best arrange them on the page. What I suggest is that you keep sort of your kind of template, right, with most of the info on it. And then you're going to, again, highlight one aspect or the other, add something, remove something, depending on what exactly you want to do with the resume in that moment. There are a few different ways to organize a resume, and again, I'll talk a little bit more specifically about them a little bit later in this video. The most common by far is chronological. That means it's like in order of time, how things happened. When you do a chronological resume, you're always going to go in reverse order, right? So the most recent thing, the current thing, is at the top of the list. The thing that is furthest away in terms of time is at the bottom of the list, right? The other couple of ways you can organize a resume is in terms of skills or in terms of function. And I'll show you some examples from the Purdue OWL website in a little bit. So in those two different schema, instead of having just a list by, when it happened, you'll bunch things or cluster things you've done and skills you have in terms of categories that you determine, all right? It's less common, but depending again on what you're trying to do with your resume, what you're applying for, etc., it may be something that fits you. So I just want to make sure you're familiar with it. There are pretty standard sections, main sections to a resume, and then there's some optional ones depending on your particular profile that you can also add. I think the basic ones are your contact information, an objective of some sort, your education, and your experience. Experience can be work, it can be other kinds of experience, right? So those, I think, are the major categories. You definitely have to have those on your resume. You can, depending on who you are, have some other stuff, like if you have particular technical skills, if you have computer skills, and that's important to the job you're applying for, then you want to highlight those. Honors and awards, right? If you, got particular awards during your time as a college student, that might be something to highlight. Languages, right? Just, again, it depends a little bit on the job, but it's, it's impressive if you know 2 languages, 3 languages, any certifications. Did you volunteer, right? And we'll talk in a sec. You can include volunteer experience under the big category experience, depending on how you do that. Professional memberships, right? If you're part of a professional organization, community service, right? So again, there's lots of other things you can add, but the thing is you want to make sure you choose what to add very purposefully based on what you're applying for and how best to demonstrate that you're a good candidate for that thing, okay? I think it's important to think of a resume not as a generic list of stuff, but really as an argument for why you're a good candidate. So you want your resume to be persuasive, right? So how you, again, present it should be making an argument about you as a candidate and you being a good fit for the specific job or position that you're applying for. Now, there's the thing about a resume is there's so many different things that it's supposed to be doing at the same time, right? So I'm saying it's supposed to make a kind of argument, but it's also supposed to be really easy for somebody to read, right? So on the one hand, you want it to be comprehensive, you want it to be saying something, and on the other hand, it needs to be something that someone can skim, right? That's really important because, as I'm sure you know, the person who's put this job ad up is going to receive a whole bunch of applications, and they're going to have to go through those resumes really quickly, right? So a resume is by definition something that is meant for somebody to be able to pretty much glance at, to skim through really quickly, like in a minute, and quickly figure out if you are potentially a good candidate, right? If they get you on the short list, then of course they're going to read it much more carefully. But so you need to not only have the info in there, but you need to format it in a way that makes it really easy for that person skimming it to see who you are and what you've done, right? So in other words, you can have a lot of great stuff on your resume. If it's formatted in a way that makes it hard to read quickly, that will really do you a disservice. Someone may not get the info that you're trying to put forward just because you didn't format it in a way that made those things pop. And we'll talk about that in a sec as well. Okay, so a resume is 1 to 2 pages. The common advice you hear is no more than 1 page. That's good to aspire to. Like a really well-made 1-page resume is great. It's not quite as cut and dried as that. A 2-page resume, nobody's going to, lose their mind over that, or 1.5-page resume. Again, it really depends mainly on what really needs to be in there. If you really have stuff, like important stuff, relevant to the job, and that takes you 1.5 pages to get through, I think that's fine, right? So you don't want to pad it ever, right? You want it to be solid stuff. So if it goes a little over 1 page, I would not worry about that, as long as the stuff really needs to be in there. As I already said, you're going to order and weight the sections of the resume based on what you're applying for. Okay, not generic, but in some kinds of contexts, you might put education first and work experience second. In others, if your degree is less important, you might put that at the bottom, right? So again, those big categories that I mentioned on the last slide, what goes in them? Contact info is pretty straightforward. It's you and all the ways to reach you, right? One small point, which, I imagine you've already heard this, but I'll just remind folks. You want to make sure that your contact info or the ways that people can contact you are sort of professional. So in other words, if your private email is a joke or is kind of goofy, set up another private email address that's more formal sounding, right? That's your name or a number, whatever it is, right? So you want to make sure, again, that all that information fits with your professional profile, all right? So for the objective or goal, right, which is a statement that goes typically at the top of the resume, you're going to use language that is exactly from the job, for the job ad, for the job you're applying to, or that at least is relevant, speaks to that, okay? So again, you do not want to have a generic objective, right? You probably do have bigger, longer term objectives, but tailor it to what you're applying for. So again, people reviewing this can see this person seems like a good fit. Like what they want to do is exactly what we need in this position, right? For the education section, you're going to, again, reverse chronological order. So if you're currently a Northeastern student finishing your bachelor's degree here, that's going to be the first entry. And then you'll go back from there. You do not need to include high school on your resume, right? If you end up getting a graduate degree, then you'll include your graduate degree and your bachelor's degree, okay? For the entry, then, you're going to include the name and location of the university, the date you graduated, the specific title of your degree. This is important, and you need to know exactly the title of your degree. Did you get a BA or a BS, right? Did you get an MA or an MS? What is the name, the title of the degree program from which you got that degree, right? So you want to make sure that you have it formally correct as that university has titled it, all right? You can include your GPA. I think lots of people do, and I think it's a fine thing to do. I don't think it's required, and I think it really depends on whether your GPA is something you really want to show off right away. If it isn't, it is something you can explain elsewhere, right, during the process of applying. But, think about that, and that is certainly a common thing that people include. There are other things that I strongly encourage you to include in the education section, right? Especially, again, if you're applying for something where what you got your education in is important. So as I've said earlier in this course, I think it's important to not leave the entire education part of your resume as just, BA in this field 2025, right? That just doesn't tell the person all that much. So in addition to your major and a minor, if you have any minors, you want to include that as well. You can also talk about, particular things you've done that are notable and important. Did you do any special projects? Did you, write a thesis? Did you do particular coursework that you think is especially relevant to this position, right? So you can add a few bullet points under your degree that give a little bit more information about what you accomplished as a student, right? So I encourage you to think about that and to do that in this exercise that we're doing for this class, okay? The other, again, second, typically big category is experience or work experience. And again, I put that in parentheses because I think it really depends on where you are in your career. If you're writing a resume at the point in your career where you had a number of relevant jobs, then you're just going to probably include work, right? The positions you've held in the past or that you currently hold. If you're at a sort of earlier point in your career, which many of you are, you can include other things that are relevant experience, even if you weren't paid for them, right? So, if you volunteered for an organization and that experience is relevant to what you are working on now, if you did an internship, right? I know a lot of you are either doing or looking forward to doing internships relevant to your career field. Any of those kinds of things, if you did field research, anything that we could put under the category of experience, even if it wasn't a job per se, I think can go into that section, right? And again, for each entry in that experience or work experience section, you want to have all the details. What was the name of the company or organization? What was your title? What were the years you worked there, right? And I'll show you some examples of resumes a little bit later in this video so you can see what those look like. And again, I'm quite sure that most, if not all of you, have done a resume before, so a lot of this stuff is not exactly new information. But I think a resume is a complex document, and it has to do a lot of work. So I think it's really worth constantly looking at your resume and kind of figuring out how to make it the best thing it can be in that moment. So, all of those kinds of things can go in the experience section. Don't be shy about including something you didn't get paid for if you think you can frame it in a way that is relevant to what you're applying for. Skills, again, not a necessary section per se. It depends on the job you're applying for. It depends on who you are and if you have skills you want to highlight. So don't put generic skills if they don't have anything to do with the position, right? You should not include things that are to be there just to be there. You want them to be relevant to what you're doing. But the kinds of things that might go in there, computer skills, if you have specific research skills, if you've done a lot of writing, if you know languages, those are places you can put those. Honors, other activities, again, these are sort of optional categories. If you got a lot of academic honors, right, that would be something to include. If you were a member in a professional organization and that's relevant, you can include that. If you got like a certification, any of those kinds of things, right, that's a place you can put that. Now, one of the things that I think is a little sometimes harder to know how to deal with is a category that people often call soft skills. My advice to you is I think it's fine to include soft skills, and I don't think it's necessarily the case that you have to include soft skills. What I would suggest is only include soft skills if they're mentioned in the job ad, right? So by soft skills, we're talking about things like team player, hard worker, self-motivated, those kinds of things, detail-oriented. Those are common things you see on resumes, right? And those are all really important things, don't get me wrong. But if there's no mention in the job ad about them looking for people with those particular soft skills, my suggestion is don't just generically include them, right? Part of the reason I say that is they're so generic that in many cases, the employer will assume that you have those skills, of course, right? Of course, they're assuming you're a hard worker, right? And that you're organized. So I don't think you need to include them if the employer in the job ad doesn't call those out specifically. If the job ad says, we're looking for a critical thinker who can work well in a group, then yeah, I would say, these are qualities I have. But if not, I would leave them out, right? Again, especially because this is supposed to be a really concise document. So we don't want to take up any space with things that really don't need to be there, okay? Now, down at the bottom in the box, I have the info about a CV, which I mentioned earlier. And again, I'm just kind of giving it to you because I think most of you will not be writing a CV, but just you're going to hear that term, so just so you know what it is. So the CV is basically the form that a resume takes for people in academia, right? So like I, as a professor, I don't write a resume, I have a CV, right? If you're a graduate student, you're working towards an academic career, you would have a CV instead of a resume. And they're a little bit different. They include a lot of the same stuff, but they're a little bit different because they're really for academic work. They're longer, right? They are not limited to the 1 to 2 pages. Some senior professors will have, 8-page CVs, right? So some of the stuff's the same, your contact information, your education, your work experience, which again, in academic life would typically be teaching. It could be other things as well. And then the rest of it is really where it gets different than the resume. So research experience, if you got research grants, if you did field work, etc., publications or presentations, again, in academic spheres, if you got, grants, and then other things like service in a university context, professional memberships, etc., right? So again, I throw this out there just to inform you about the definition of a CV, even as I don't think any of you will probably need to do one. Okay. Another part of those kind of initial application materials is references. And again, different jobs sort of say different things, so you need to really follow what the job ad says. Some folks will ask you to sort of present a list of referees up front. Others will have you have a referee send a letter, right? If it's like an application to graduate school, typically you'll be asked to solicit letters from 2 or 3 people, and they'll submit them, right, about you. So, follow the instructions on whatever you're applying for, but a few pieces of advice about getting references from people. The first is to make sure you contact the people, the individuals that you're asking or that you're writing as your referees, right? It's not a good idea to put somebody as a reference and not tell them about it. They will then get a call or a email asking them to do this thing that they weren't kind of thinking they were going to be doing, right? So give people a heads up, right? Either that they may get a call because you've applied for this job and you've listed them as a referee, or that, you will be soliciting a letter from them, etc. Prepare your referees. Don't only tell them it's going to happen, but, give them the information they need. If you've just applied for a bunch of jobs and you've listed someone as a referee, let them know, and also send them your current resume, right? Or if it's graduate school, your statement of purpose, so that if they get that call or that email asking about you, they can say really detailed stuff about how great you are, right? You want to equip your referees to say sort of the best and most important things about you. And the only way they can do that is if they really know what you've been up to recently, right? So, for example, if I have a student who graduated 5 years ago, I can already say all kinds of great things about what they did 5 years ago. But if they've been doing all this interesting stuff since then, I want to know about that so that I can also talk about those things. So keep your referees up to date on what you've been working on. And then the final thing is just to make sure you give those folks time. Again, especially if it's something where you're asking them to write a letter, which is, not uncommon, it's ideal if you can give people at least 2 weeks sometimes it didn't work out that way, so it's fine to ask people to write a letter with less time. 2 weeks is great. More is even better. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about design, because as I mentioned earlier in this video, part of what you're doing with a resume is like content, like you really want to cover all these certain bases. The other part is that it needs to be something that somebody can really quickly read, skim, really, right? So the formatting of it comes into that, right? So there's a few principles, like design principles for a resume that I think apply sort of across the board. So that doesn't mean all resumes look the same. And there's all kinds of templates out there, some of which I'll show you in a sec, for how exactly your resume looks. So it doesn't have to be completely generic, but I think there are some standard principles that you want to think about as you figure out what your resume is going to look like, okay? So simple and clean. That means sort of easily readable, neatly organized, right? Don't use a ton of different fonts. Don't use weird fonts, right? Use kind of standard fonts. No more than 2 on the resume. It can't just be 1. You can, though, as I say down here in the bottom of the list, you definitely can and want to make it more readable with things like slightly bigger fonts or bigger point fonts of whatever you're using. You can use bold, you can use italics, you can use underline. So you do want to use some of those kinds of things, but you don't want to have a ton of different fonts, and you don't want to have fonts that are not easily read, right? Very clean fonts is the idea. You also want to do something called parallelism. And what that means is in any sort of category on the resume, you're going to typically have like some bullets of different stuff you've done, right? Or you're going to have like, 3 of your jobs listed with like an explanation underneath of what the job was or whatever, right? Wherever you have like the same kind of thing on the resume, you want it the way it is grammatically constructed to be parallel, okay? So I give you an example here, right? Like if you have 3 bullets under one of your jobs to explain what your duties were in that job, you'd want to say something like designed courses, evaluated performances, reviewed portfolios, right? Those are grammatically parallel. That's what you want. Again, it makes it easier to read if they take the same format. What you don't want to do, right? So this is now the don't do this category, is have them be all different from each other, right? So something like designing courses, evaluated performances, as part of the team reviewed portfolios. Those are saying basically the same thing as the top one, but they're all grammatically different. And again, it just makes it harder for your brain to kind of wrap around it. So it's much less easy to skim the one where they're all different than to skim the one where they're all the same, okay? So that's parallelism, and you want to apply that to how you do your resumes for this assignment. Quadrants is the next thing. And the red lines on this example show you what quadrants means. The idea is that you want to have roughly the same amount of text in all 4 quadrants of the page, right? So in other words, you don't want to have all the info up against the left-hand margin and then blank space on the right, right? You want to spread this stuff out across the page so that you have sort of, again, roughly kind of evenly distributed text. Again, it makes it easier to skim. The way you'll accomplish that is typically through using columns, right? Columns going left to right. So, there's different ways to do that, but you could, for example, have, if you have several entries under work experience, you could have something like the name of the company or the title of the job in the left-hand column, and then over on the right-hand column, you'd have the date, right? So somebody reading that entry would read across, right? It would be kind of a horizontal entry. So that's the idea. That's how you get that sort of spread across the page. And that's the way to organize them so that each entry looks the same, right? You have columns, so stuff is evenly spaced and consistently spaced across all the items in that category. And then, as I said, you do still want to help folks read it by using things like font or underlining. You can center something, you can use columns. All of those kinds of things that you would use just in word processing are important to apply to something like this. Okay, Now, for this assignment, what you're going to be doing is either writing a resume and a cover letter, or writing a statement of purpose, okay? So if you're doing the resume option, you're also going to write a cover letter. It's like you've got two little parts of it. If you're writing a statement of purpose, it's just one thing, the statement, right? So for the cover letter component, cover letters are, something that in a typical job application, you're always going to include a cover letter with your resume, right? So the idea is your resume, although it has really all the information, you want to sort of introduce yourself and introduce your resume to whoever you're, applying for or applying to. So some principles of the cover letter, right? It needs to be brief. It's even more important that it's brief even than the resume, I'd say, right? Definitely no more than one page. A lot of cover letters are just a few paragraphs, so kind of less than a page. Use the language from the job ad in your letter. You are writing specifically to the person who is hiring for that job, okay? So you want to talk about how you are excited, not in general about the fields, but about that position, okay? Again, as I said, for the resume, I would have, like, if you're doing a big job search and you're going to apply to 50 jobs, have a sort of template that you keep on your computer, and then you can tweak it for each individual job, all right? As with any letter, you're going to start with a salutation at the top, right? You're going to have the contact information for the person you're writing to. You're going to have a salutation. And then there's kind of a 3-paragraph sequence that I encourage you to follow. First paragraph, or first part of the letter, is an introduction where you identify the job you're applying for and where you found it, right? Like, I'm interested or I'm thrilled to, apply for XYZ position. Then I found the post on whatever website or wherever it was that you found it. And then you can also say, what you've included. Like, I've included my resume, and if there's something else that was asked for in the job, sometimes they'll ask you for other things. I've included my resume and writing sample, whatever it may be, right? So they know that this is kind of the first thing they're going to read, and they know what's coming in your whole application packet, right? The second paragraph, you're going to talk about how you meet the qualifications that they specifically list in the job ad, and ideally with specific examples, right? What you're doing here is you're making an argument about how you are a good fit for the job, right? So again, don't just generically say, I've done this, I've done that. Be purposeful with what you highlight and how you highlight it as regards the specific position that you're applying for, all right? And then you're going to have kind of a closing paragraph, which is, thank you, I look forward to hearing from you, etc. And then you're going to sign it, right? Like, that's kind of the main structure. Again, brief to the point. Now, so really the second paragraph is the paragraph that's doing all the heavy lifting, right? That's really the most important paragraph. What I'll say about that paragraph is, do not recite everything that's on your resume. That's not the point of the cover letter. Instead, you're going to highlight what it is about you that makes you an excellent candidate for this job. That can include, and probably will include, things that are on your resume, but you're not going to try to tell them everything. The point is for them to go read your resume, right? But you want the cover letter to already give them a hint that this would be a resume worth reading, right? You want to make them interested to read your resume. So pick some very specific aspects of your resume to highlight in the cover letter to, again, encourage them to move on and more carefully look at your application materials. That's the point of the cover letter. Okay, now I wanted to just show you quickly some examples from the sources that I included in this unit. So hopefully you've already looked at these or will be looking at these. So I'm not going to look at sort of everything that's in these links, but a couple of things that I think are really important. And then I do also want to give you one extra link that wasn't already included in there. So I think this is a really great resource. It's this Harvard Extension School document about resumes and cover letters. Let me just quickly show you this. Oh, okay. All right. So this has all kinds of information about resumes and cover letters, and I think it's really worth reading the whole thing. But one of the cool things it has is some specific examples. It also has stuff about cover letters, right? but it has some specific examples, right? So the stuff I was just talking about both what you include and how it's formatted, all that, you can see some examples of how these sort of different students, right, have done it, okay? So it gives you sort of both what they all should have and also a range of at least some options, right? So here's one where, again, we have the education at the top. And then, again, remember I said when you talk about your education, it doesn't need to be just one line about your degree. You can include some other stuff that you think is important, right? Here's a student who says, here's the thing I did. And then, I did a capstone project. So you're calling that out and saying, I did a capstone project on this subject, right? It's demonstrating that you have a particular interest, a particular skill set within that degree, right? And then, again, for whatever position this person's applying for, sounds like specific technical skills are important. They put that in second position. And then professional experience, which again, remember the column thing. So this has the name of the company, the location on the right, and then they did job title on the left and date range on the right? So, and you're going to do that consistently, so all the entries look the same, basically, right? So again, makes it really easy for someone to read. And again, here's an example of a 2-page resume. It's not the end of the world if it's more than 1 page. Here's another version, right? So same basic stuff, but it just looks a little different. They formatted it a little differently. They use different font. So it should give you some ideas, right, about how to do it. Both of these resumes, you may note, the way they talk about the specifics of each entry is with bullets. And I think that's a very good way to do it. Having too much text, too much language on the page just discourages people, frankly, from reading it. Having a few short bullets is way more effective. Again, it allows people to quickly skim through and to know more about what you're doing without getting bogged down in a lot of reading. I'll show you one more. Here's another one. Again, this one has, they call it summary. That's the objective or goal, right? Very common to have some kind of overview thing about who you are, what your goals are in life at the top. And this one, again, started with these core competencies. That's relevant to whatever this person is applying for. You have to make those decisions about how to order stuff because you want to emphasize one thing or another, okay? Experience, and then education at the bottom, okay? So again, use this resource to help you get a sense of, when you start writing up your own, or if you already have written one, you can use these as things to compare to, right? What do these examples do that maybe I want to, steal that because it looks good and I want to apply it to my own resume, all right? So we want to be constantly, as I've said already, looking at stuff, seeing how we can even more improve our resumes. It's never a static document, right? You want it to be something that's sort of ongoing work. Okay, so that's the Harvard extension. Then the other one I wanted to draw your attention to is this Purdue OWL, right, which is a website that has tons of information about all kinds of stuff relevant to what you're doing as a student. This is the one that gives you some examples of, as I mentioned earlier in the video, some different approaches to resumes. Like I said, by far the most common one is the chronological resume, which, we've already, all the examples we're looking at have that. So it's something where, right, you start from the most recent, in this case of this resume, it's 2010, and you go backward to 2009, 2008, etc., right? So the organizational principle is, the passage of time, things that happened over a timeline. Now, the other ones that you can consider, depending on your situation and what you're trying to say about yourself, here's a skills resume. So this is one that's not going to go in chronological order per se, but it's going to be organized around skills, right? So in this example, in this case of this person, they are highlighting their skills in coordinating and training, right? So they're taking some of the things they've done or skills from across their whole history of experience and highlighting them in that way, right? So instead of saying, I did job A, I did job B, I did job C, saying, I have this set of skills that I accrued from across all 3 of those jobs, right? So again, depending on what you're applying for, it might be relevant. And then the final one is a functional resume. I'm not going to do the interactive resume. You can look at that on your own if you want. But this is kind of similar to the skills in that you are, again, kind of highlighting a set of things that you've done across several different kinds of positions, right? So in this case, this person is really focusing on the kinds of functions that were attached to particular positions, right? And how those things sort of all add up to something bigger, okay? So think about how your own experience would be best presented in terms of what you've done and also in terms of what you're applying for. Okay, so the last thing I want to show you is, and I'm sure probably you are all familiar with this, but I just want to underline it. There are a lot of templates out there for resumes, and I think a lot of them are really good. Some of them are kind of ridiculous, but so in other words, you can start from a template and build all those things we've talked about into the template. So, or you can just start with a blank piece of paper or Word document and type the stuff out yourself. Either way, but try to, if you use a template especially, choose a template that does the things we've been talking about, right? So, let's see if they'll let me look at this. This is this resume, create a new resume, okay. Resume Now is this one. It's free, although of course it wants to have me actually fill it out, which I'm not going to do. But I'm hoping you can kind of see the options. Let me go back to, let me go back to this page. So it's free. Oh, here we go. Sorry. Kind of doing this on the fly. No, it still won't let me look at them. Okay, let's just look at the front page. Again, you can use these. They're not going to charge you, but they do make you start building your own stuff, right? Like they're not letting me just look at the generic version of it. So, but you can see there's these different kind of, oh, maybe I can preview it. Kind of, right? Like, so you can see how it's laid out, right? This one is in 2 big columns, right? So instead of the stuff we were looking at before where everything kind of stretches from left to right, it's more like there's some categories on the left column and some categories on the right. So that's one way to do it, right? This one is a little bit more like what we've been talking about, right? So again, columns stretched out with individual items under a particular category. This one is a little bit more, jazzed up with different colors and like personal information over here. You can do that. I would suggest the more sort of creative the resume is, or more sort of colorful and more sort of items on it, think about what you're applying for and what the conventions in that field are. I think that's really important. If you're applying for a creative position, right, there's way more, I think, relevance to having a sort of creative resume. If you're applying for a kind of position or to a kind of business or field where that would not seem particularly appropriate, then stick to something a little bit more basic, right? Personally, I think stuff with like random graphics doesn't do you any favors, right? I'm not sure what the big quotation marks are about, but I think a rule of thumb, let me put it this way. You want the person looking at your resume to be focused on you and your skills, abilities, credentials, etc., right? And you want to figure out the best way for that to happen, okay? So any kinds of choices, if you use one of these templates, choices about formatting, how the thing's organized, what colors it is, all that stuff, make sure that all those things facilitate somebody quickly reading your resume and figuring out how fabulous you are and what a great candidate you are. So you don't want anything on your resume that's a distraction, right? If I got this resume for somebody applying for something that I was looking for to hire someone, I would find stuff like this random graphic distracting, okay? So that's, those are decisions you need to make about your own personal resume, but I think less is more on a resume, all right? Clean and neat, succinct, very readable. Those are the kinds of qualities that we really want in a resume as a document. Okay. All right. So I hope this has been helpful. Again, I know you have probably already written a resume at some point, gotten various advice about resumes. So this is really just meant to add to this. So the assignment that you'll be working on, right, there, as you may have seen, there's going to be two parts. Really, we're going to do an assignment where you do the first draft of your documents. And then there's another assignment where you do the second draft, right, where you sort of polish it up, respond to feedback, etc. So as I said, you have a choice. For this assignment that's coming up, you're either going to do a resume and a cover letter, or you're going to do a statement of purpose, okay? And the main thing I want is that you're going to take into consideration what you have learned from the videos and readings for these last two units, the unit on graduate schools and the unit on resumes that we're doing right now. So you want to make sure that you have heard all the information that's been a part of those units and that you apply that information to the documents you turn in, right? So if you already have a resume, that's great. You've got a good head start. But what I want you to do is to look at all the information provided through the materials for this unit and look at the resume you've been using for the last couple of years and see if it follows all those things. See if there's ways you can revise it to take on board and apply what you've learned in this unit, okay? So that's really the idea. Like I say in the instructions for this sort of the draft version, this is the first draft and you're going to revise it. So for this first draft, don't worry so much about length, right? As I've said, being succinct is important for both of these kinds of documents, for both a resume and a statement of purpose. But it's a good idea, I think, to write as much as you think is relevant for that first draft, which may mean it's longer because you're trying to get everything out on the page. That's better. And then, because you get it all in there, and then for the second version of it, you're going to edit that and make some decisions about, well, do I really want to keep all this stuff? Maybe I could, if I see all this stuff and it's 3 pages, how can I condense it? Which things do I want to keep? Which do I want to leave? Okay. So don't worry about length for this first version of your resume and cover letter or statement of purpose. Focus more on getting the information in, getting the formatting right, etc. And then for the follow-up assignment, when you're revising it for the final version of these documents, then you can really work on cutting it down to size and making sure that it's just what needs to be there. Okay? All right. Well, good luck on the assignment. We'll talk again soon. Bye.